Picture a battlefield in the late 14th century. The air is thick with smoke, blood, and the screaming of horses. A European army, proud knights in gleaming armor, crossbowmen, infantry hardened by decades of crusader warfare, stands in careful formation. They have faced Mongols, Saracens, and the finest warriors the Christian world could produce. They believe themselves unbeatable. Then the drums begin. A slow, thunderous rhythm rolls across the field, low at first, barely audible over the clamor of men. Then it grows. The rhythm is joined by the piercing wail of a zurna, a double-reeded horn that shreds through the noise of battle. The European commanders look toward the Ottoman lines, and there they see them for the first time. Ranks of men in white felt caps, moving in absolute perfect unison, their faces expressionless, their eyes locked forward like men carved from stone. They do not shout, they do not rage. They simply march, shoulder to shoulder, step by step, as if they are one single creature. These are the Janissarys, and within the hour, the European army ceases to exist. Not defeated, not routed, erased, annihilated with a surgical, methodical violence that leaves the survivors shaking. The Janissarys do not pursue fleeing enemies in wild bloodlust. They advance, they engage, they destroy, and then they return to formation, clean, disciplined, already prepared for the next order. For nearly 5 centuries, this scene would play out, from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Hungarian plains to the shores of North Africa. The Janissarys would become the most feared military force in the known world, and their story is one of the most extraordinary. This is their story. To understand the Janissarys, you first have to understand the world they were born into, because they did not appear out of nowhere. They were a solution to a very specific problem. The Ottoman state was founded around 1299 by a Turkic tribal chief named Osman I in the northwestern corner of Anatolia. He ruled a small frontier principality on the edge of the crumbling Byzantine Empire. This region was called a beylik. It was one of dozens of small Turkish statelets that had emerged as the old Seljuk Sultanate broke apart under Mongol invasions. What made Osman's beylik different was geography and ambition. Situated on the frontier between the Islamic and Christian worlds, Osman's people were ideal Ghazis, holy warriors who raided and fought against the infidel. This gave his state a constant influx of volunteers. The early Ottoman state grew not through careful bureaucratic expansion, but through constant raiding, warfare, and absorption of rivals. Osman's son, Orhan, expanded the state dramatically after his father's death around 1323. He captured Bursa in 1326, making it the first major Ottoman capital city. He crossed into Europe for the first time, helping a Byzantine claimant to the throne. He was, in short, a man building an empire out of opportunity, opportunism, and sheer military force. But herein lay the problem. The Ottoman state in these early decades was built on a tribal military model. Its armies were composed primarily of the Akıncı, irregular cavalry raiders, mostly Turkish nomads and tribal warriors who fought for plunder. They were fast, aggressive, and effective at raiding, but they were not an army you could rely on for siege warfare or holding territory, or for standing up to the disciplined heavy cavalry and infantry of European armies in a pitched battle. They would charge when they sensed victory and melt away when they sensed defeat. Their loyalty was to their tribal leaders and wealth, not to the Ottoman Sultan as an institution. Orhan recognized this problem and began experimenting with solutions. He created one of the earliest prototypes of a standing paid infantry force, men called the Yaya, foot soldiers, who were paid a regular wage and organized in a more disciplined fashion than the tribal levies. But the Yaya were still free men, still Turks with lives and connections outside the army, still prone to the loyalties and unreliabilities that came with being embedded in a tribal society. His son, Murad I, who came to power around 1360, would provide the permanent solution, and in doing so, he would change the history of the world. Murad I was one of the most consequential rulers in Ottoman history, a man whose decisions echoed for 500 years. He expanded the Ottoman Empire dramatically into Europe, establishing control over Thrace, much of the Balkans, and setting the stage for the eventual conquest of Constantinople. But his most important contribution was not a conquered city or a won battle. It was an idea about how to build a military force that was loyal not to a tribe, not to a family, not to a regional lord, but to the Sultan alone. The solution Murad and his advisors devised was radical and deeply controversial. It was called the Devshirme, a Turkish word meaning collection or gathering. And what was being collected was children. The Devshirme was a systematic levy of young boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, taken from Christian populations. These boys came primarily from the Balkans, from Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Albania, Bosnia, and later Hungary. They were, by Ottoman law, the children of Christian families living under Ottoman rule. They were not enslaved in the traditional sense. The system was formalized, regularized, and subject to rules. Families with only one son were typically exempt. But fundamentally, Christian families in Ottoman territories were required on a rotating basis to surrender their sons to the state. These boys were brought to Istanbul, or to Bursa in the earliest years, where they underwent a complete transformation. They were converted to Islam. They were given new names. They were stripped of every connection to their former lives, their family, their language, their religion, their community, and then they were educated and trained within a system that was designed from the ground up to produce one thing, the perfect soldier servant of the Ottoman Sultan. The name given to this new force is worth unpacking. Janissary comes from the Turkish Janissary, which means simply new soldiers. Yeni, new. Cherry, soldier. They were new in every sense of the word. New religion, new language, new identity, new allegiance. The genius of the system, and it was, in a cold and calculating way, genuine genius, was that it solved the central problem of medieval military loyalty in a single stroke. In the feudal world, every soldier ultimately had competing loyalties. A knight owed loyalty to his lord, his king, his church, his family, his clan. A tribal warrior owed loyalty to his tribe. These competing claims on loyalty made armies unpredictable, prone to factionalism, and vulnerable to power politics. The Janissaries had no competing loyalties. They had no family in the conventional sense. They were forbidden to marry. They had no property. They had no tribal affiliation. They had no pre-existing religious or ethnic identity. They belonged entirely to the Ottoman Sultan, and the Ottoman Sultan belonged to them in a very specific way. He was their patron, their master, their source of all reward and advancement. The Sultan fed them. The Sultan housed them. The Sultan paid them. The Sultan alone determined whether they lived or died, rose or fell. This was unprecedented in the medieval world. It was a standing, professional, salaried army, answerable to a single commander. 500 years before European states would manage to create anything similar, the Janissaries stood as a unique force. Boys taken through the Devshirme were sorted according to their physical and intellectual qualities, a rigorous selection process. The most promising were sent to the palace schools, the Enderun, for an extraordinary education. They learned Turkish, Arabic, Persian, mathematics, theology, music, and the arts of war and governance. These boys became not just soldiers, but administrators, viziers, governors, even grand viziers, the most powerful officials. Some of the greatest Ottoman statesmen were Devshirme boys, pillars of the Islamic Empire. The majority of recruits were channeled directly into military training, serving as a semi-oglanlar or novice recruits. This period of training and indoctrination could last several years, shaping them into disciplined soldiers. They worked in Turkish farms or estates in Anatolia, learning Turkish and internalizing Ottoman culture. This developed the physical toughness that military life required, preparing them for the Janissary Corps. When their training was complete, they were formally enrolled in the Janissary Corps, the Okak, meaning hearth or household. The imagery of the hearth was not accidental. The Janissaries were organized as a household. Their central symbol was not a weapon or battle standard, but a cooking pot, the great cauldron. The kazan was the most sacred object in a Janissary regiment, symbolizing identity, honor, and continuity. To lose your cauldron in battle was the deepest possible shame, a profound dishonor. To overturn the cauldron was the Janissary way of declaring revolt, a powerful act of defiance. Each regiment, called an orta, was organized around this domestic imagery, fostering a strong bond. The commanding officer of an orta was called the chorbacha, meaning soup man or broth maker. The men ate together, trained together, and lived together in their barracks, forging deep connections. Their bond was closer to a family, structured around shared meals, ritual, identity, and iron discipline. This discipline was maintained through both pride and fear, creating an unyielding force. The Janissarys were barely forming when the Ottomans fought their first major European engagements. But by the time Murad V met the Serbian coalition at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, they were a significant force. Kosovo would be their first major test on a European battlefield, a pivotal moment in history. The Battle of Kosovo on June 28, 1389, is one of the most mythologized battles in Balkan history. For the Serbs, it is the defining national tragedy, a catastrophe that persisted in folk memory for 600 years. For the Ottomans, it confirmed their status as a European power to be reckoned with. For the Janissarys, it was their formal introduction to the world, showcasing their formidable prowess. The Serbian coalition, led by Prince Lazar, was substantial, including knights, nobles, and warriors. The Serbs had quality cavalry and had proven themselves against the Ottomans in earlier engagements. Murad's army was larger, perhaps 60 to 80,000 men against 30 to 40,000 Serbs. It was organized in a way no European army had encountered before, a testament to Ottoman innovation. The Ottomans deployed in three main formations, Anatolian and Rumelian cavalry on the wings. In the center was the Janissary Corps, protected behind wooden barriers and ropes tied to sharpened stakes. This crude but effective defensive fortification was designed to slow cavalry charges, a clever tactic. Behind the Janissarys in the rear stood the Sultan himself with his household cavalry, commanding the battle. The battle opened with the Serbian cavalry charging the Ottoman left flank, hitting hard. For a moment it seemed the Ottoman line might break, a critical point in the battle. But the Janissarys in the center held. They did not panic, they did not flinch. They stood behind their barrier and poured arrows into the Serbian cavalry's flank as it advanced, then shifted to engage with hand weapons as the Serbs tried to push through, a brutal close-quarters fight. Meanwhile, the Ottoman cavalry on the right counterattacked, turning the tide of battle. The Serbian advance was stopped and then reversed, leading to their ultimate defeat. Prince Lazar was captured and executed, marking the effective end of the Serbian kingdom. The Janissarys had demonstrated their power, disciplined infantry, fighting in coordination with cavalry. Behind prepared positions, they were almost impossible to dislodge, a new military paradigm. Murad V himself was assassinated at Kosovo, stabbed by a Serbian nobleman named Miloš Obilić. Obilić had pretended to defect and was granted an audience with the Sultan, a cunning deception. This gave the battle its mythic quality, a Serbian victory in death, even as their army was destroyed. Murad's son Bayezid I took command immediately, showing decisiveness. Bayezid had his brother Yaqub executed on the spot, eliminating a potential rival. He then returned to managing the victory and would later be nicknamed Yildirim, or Thunderbolt. Bayezid continued to use and expand the Janissaries throughout his reign, recognizing their value. He pushed deep into the Balkans, laid siege to Constantinople for 7 years, and defeated a massive Crusader army. This was at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, one of the worst Christian military disasters. A Franco-Burgundian-Hungarian crusading force launched an assault without adequate reconnaissance or coordination. The French knights, full of aristocratic arrogance, charged uphill toward the Ottoman lines. They crashed into the Janissary formations and were brutally repulsed, their charge broken. The Janissaries, standing behind their familiar barrier of stakes and ropes, simply absorbed the cavalry charge. The horses could not build up enough speed, the knights could not maintain formation on the slope. Disciplined Janissary archers cut them down as they floundered, a deadly rain of arrows. Then the Ottoman cavalry swung in from both flanks, and the crusading army was annihilated. 10,000 crusaders were taken prisoner, most executed the following day. Bayezid, surveying his losses, decided he did not want to feed them, a harsh but pragmatic decision. The message of Nicopolis echoed across Europe. The Ottomans had infantry capable of stopping heavy cavalry. In the late 14th century, that was something very few armies in the world could claim. Bayezid's reign ended in catastrophe, not at European hands, but at the hands of Timur, Tamerlane. Timur swept out of Central Asia and destroyed the Ottoman army at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. Bayezid himself was captured and died in captivity, a tragic end for the Thunderbolt. The Janissaries who survived the disaster retreated with the remnants of the Ottoman force. The empire plunged into a decade of civil war, the Ottoman interregnum, as Bayezid's sons fought for the throne. That the empire survived this crisis at all was partly because the Janissaries remained a coherent force. They attached themselves to various claimants, but the core itself did not disintegrate. The institutional identity of the Janissaries proved stronger than the political crisis. When Mehmed Vamai finally reunified the empire in 1413, the Janissaries were still there, still organized, still effective. Before we delve into the great campaigns of the Janissary era, let's examine what made these men so formidable in battle. Their effectiveness wasn't just courage, but superior equipment, training, tactics, and an organizational culture centuries ahead of its time. In their earliest period, the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Janissaries were primarily an infantry archer force. Their main weapon, the composite bow, was technologically superior to European self-bows. Its compact form allowed enormous draw weight, essential for archers in tight formations, unlike the long draw of the English longbow. Janissary archers were trained from boyhood, with years of dedicated practice to master the composite bow. An experienced archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute with accuracy, maintaining this rate for sustained periods. In formation, a regiment created a storm of arrows, impossible for unprotected infantry or cavalry to advance through. But Janissaries were never purely archers. From the earliest period, they trained with a range of close-quarters weapons. The yataghan, a distinctive single-edged sword with a forward-curving blade, was almost unique to the Janissary corps. It became a cultural symbol, often decorated and worn tucked through the belt, ready for instant use. Their tactical revolution combined missile fire with close-quarters combat in a single, disciplined unit. Unlike European infantry, Janissaries transitioned seamlessly between roles, pouring fire, then closing for hand-to-hand combat. They could withdraw in order, counterattack, and hold ground against cavalry assaults, unlike pure archers. The tabur, or wagon fort, was essential to early Janissary doctrine against cavalry-heavy armies. They positioned themselves behind barriers, slowing cavalry charges, allowing archers to decimate attackers before reaching infantry lines. This combination was devastatingly effective, neutralizing heavy cavalry, the most powerful offensive weapon of the medieval arsenal. The introduction of firearms changed everything, and the Janissaries adapted faster than almost any other military force. Firearms appeared in the 1380s, but under Murad II and Mehmed II, gunpowder weapons became central to Janissary doctrine. They were among the first professional infantry to adopt the arquebus as a standard weapon. By Mehmed II's reign, Janissary units with firearms were a regular part of Ottoman battle formations. Integrating firearms followed their archery tradition. Skills like aiming, timing, and coordinated volleys translated directly. They were already trained in the psychological discipline of holding fire until the optimal moment. Organized for coordinated missile fire, they had the command structure for firing by rank. This was significant, as widespread firearm adoption in Europe is dated to the latter 15th century with the military revolution. The Janissaries had professional standing infantry with gunpowder weapons before any major European state. They were a military revolution, largely independent and roughly simultaneous with, if not slightly before, European developments. The Janissaries also had a weapon unparalleled in the medieval world, the greatest artillery train in existence. They operated alongside the Ottoman artillery corps, the Topçu, forming the most powerful military force of the 15th century. Mehmed II's engineers cast great bombards, firing hundreds of pounds of cannonballs used to breach or demoralize defenses. The Janissarys then exploited the breach, completing the integrated system. No event in Janissary history is more dramatic or consequential than the fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453. Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire, had withstood sieges for over 1,000 years. Its Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, were the most formidable defensive fortification in the world. They had never been successfully stormed, breached only once by treachery and sea assault in 1204. Mehmed II, 21 years old, was obsessed with Constantinople, believing it his destiny to take the city. He prepared for years, building a fortress on the Bosphorus to cut off supplies. He commissioned Hungarian engineer Urban to cast unprecedented cannons capable of throwing 600-pound stone balls over a mile. He assembled an army of perhaps 80,000 men, possibly more. The city was defended by about 8,000 men, Byzantine soldiers and Genoese mercenaries under Giovanni Giustiniani. Byzantine Emperor Constantine V refused to surrender, knowing what defeat meant, yet he fought anyway. The siege lasted 53 days. The great Ottoman cannons pounded the Theodosian walls relentlessly. The defenders repaired breaches each night, only for the cannons to open them again each day. It was a grinding contest of will and resources, and slowly, the defenders' resources ran out. The Janissarys made multiple major assaults during the siege of Constantinople. They were the critical shock force, deployed when Mehmed II wanted to apply maximum pressure. In the final assault, before dawn on May 29th, waves of irregular troops exhausted the defenders. The first wave suffered terrible casualties and were driven back. The second wave pushed harder but were also repulsed. Giovanni Giustiniani, the organizing intelligence of the defense, was wounded, a catastrophic blow to morale. Then the Janissarys came. In the grey light, to the thunder of drums and wail of horns, 12,000 advanced. They advanced on the Kirkoporta gate, left unlocked or slightly open by oversight. Others pushed through breaches already made by cannon fire. The exhausted defenders could not hold. Constantine V died fighting, the last Roman emperor, his body never identified. Constantinople fell. The city that defined the boundary between worlds was now Ottoman. Mehmed quickly restored order, and the city became Istanbul, the new capital. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church, was converted to a mosque. The fall sent shockwaves through Europe, marking the death of the Roman world. For the Janissarys, it was a triumph that cemented their status in the Mediterranean world. They were no longer just the Sultan's household troops, but a force that achieved the impossible. This victory shaped their identity and growing importance for generations. The century between Constantinople's fall and Suleiman's death was their absolute peak. The corps expanded, professionalized, and succeeded across the vast Ottoman Empire. Under Mehmed II, the Janissary Corps expanded significantly, from 5 to 12,000. They were the core, the elite, around which the rest of the Ottoman military was organized. Mehmed II formalized the orta structure, establishing 196 companies. Each orta had a specific number, name, and function, with a clear hierarchy. Pay was regularized. Janissaries received a fixed daily wage, paid 4 times a year. The system was managed through detailed registers, tracking every man in the corps. Under Bayezid II, the corps grew, serving against Venetians, Mamluks, and Safavid Persians. It was under Selim I, Selim the Grim, that they made dramatic eastern conquests. Selim was determined to destroy the Safavid Persian state, a direct threat to stability. He marched east in 1514, despite enormous logistical challenges, reaching Chaldiran. The Battle of Chaldiran, 1514, pitted 2 different military systems against each other. The Safavid army, under Shah Ismail, relied on superb cavalry, but had never faced firearms. The Janissaries had them in very significant numbers. Selim deployed Janissaries behind a fortified line of carts and cannon. The Safavid cavalry charged, met with cannon fire and arquebus volleys that cut them apart. Shah Ismail was wounded. The Kizilbash cavalry could not reach the Janissary lines. Ottoman cavalry swept in and the Safavid army broke. The threat to Anatolia was checked. Selim then turned south. In 1516 and 1517, he destroyed the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks were legendary warriors, but relied almost entirely on cavalry tactics. At Majdabik and Ridaniya, Ottoman firepower devastated Mamluk cavalry. The Mamluk Sultanate ceased to exist. Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz came under Ottoman control. Selim's son, Suleiman I, brought the empire and Janissarys to their absolute peak. Suleiman reigned for 46 years, leading 13 major military campaigns. He captured Belgrade in 1521 and destroyed the Hungarian kingdom at Mohacs in 1526. He besieged Vienna in 1529, reaching further into Europe than any Ottoman army. He conquered Iraq from the Persians and extended Ottoman power across North Africa. His navies, commanded by Barbarossa, dominated the Mediterranean. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 deserves special attention as a showcase of Janissary tactics at their finest. King Louis II of Hungary led an army of approximately 25,000 men against a much larger Ottoman force. The Ottoman advantage was not just numbers, but superior organization and discipline. The Hungarian knights, proud and aggressive, fatally underestimated their enemy. They charged. The Janissarys, behind their fortified line, allowed the cavalry to close to a certain distance. Then, coordinated artillery and arquebus volleys blew apart the advancing formations. The charge became a catastrophe. Survivors were then hit by Ottoman cavalry on the flanks. The battle was over in about 90 minutes. King Louis drowned while fleeing. The medieval Kingdom of Hungary effectively ceased to exist, absorbed into the Ottoman sphere. The Janissaries in Suleiman's era were at the height of their physical and organizational development. The corps numbered between 12 and 20,000 active soldiers by the mid-16th century. All were equipped with firearms as their primary weapons, organized into traditional ortas. Each orta had established traditions, rivalries, and esprit de corps. Their discipline in camp was remarkable, maintaining internal courts and self-policing. Their weapons reflected the best technology of the age, the matchlock arquebus. It was slow to reload, vulnerable to rain and wind, and required significant skill. But in the hands of trained, disciplined men who could coordinate their fire, it was devastatingly effective. The standard Janissary battle formation involved multiple ranks of arquebusiers firing in sequence. The front rank fires, moves to the rear to reload, the second rank steps forward and fires, and so on. This technique appeared independently in various forms, but Janissaries were among the earliest and most disciplined practitioners. It required the steady, unshakable nerve under fire that Janissary training was designed to produce. Think about how the Janissary system worked. The Devshirme, taking boys from their families, erasing identities. Conversion to Islam, a lifetime of military service. Was this system a form of slavery, or something else entirely? Brutal and transformative at the same time? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, as historians still debate this complex question. The Janissaries developed a ferocious pride in their identity, core, and religion. Many Devshirme boys rose to the very top of the Ottoman Empire. What does that tell us about identity, loyalty, and the nature of power? Let us know what you think. We have spent considerable time on the battlefield where the Janissaries made history. But for most of a Janissary's life, there was no active campaign. Their years were spent in barracks, markets, coffee houses, and city streets. The Janissary was not simply a warrior, but a significant social, economic, and political actor. The Janissary barracks, the Kushla, were substantial complexes, almost like small cities. The main barracks in Istanbul, the Kapısı, housed thousands of men. It provided food, housing, training grounds, and religious facilities. Each orta maintained its own communal spaces. The cauldron was a central symbol. Meals were eaten communally, a ritual of unit cohesion. In early centuries, Janissaries were forbidden to marry, ensuring undivided loyalties. This principle held for the first 2 centuries, though with varying rigor. They were also forbidden from engaging in trade or owning significant property. They were soldiers, pure and simple. But Janissary life was far from austere. They received regular salaries and bonuses. By medieval and early modern standards, a Janissary was well paid. In Istanbul, they had access to the full commercial life of a great metropolis. They frequented bazaars, bathhouses, and coffeehouses, a Janissary cultural contribution. Janissaries also held significant roles in the peacetime security apparatus of the empire. They served as garrison troops, bodyguards for governors, and police forces. In Istanbul, they maintained public order, fought fires, and guarded the gates. This gave them an enormous presence in the daily life of the city. Over time, the line between Janissary and civilian became increasingly blurred. From the late 16th century, Janissaries engaged in trades and crafts. He might be married, with children, living in a city house, not the barracks. His Janissary status still carried privileges and pay, but his life was indistinguishable from an urban artisan. This blurring of identity was both a symptom and a cause of the corps' eventual decline. But at its height, the Janissary presence in urban life was a force for stability and order. The corps had its own internal justice system, medical facilities, mosques, and religious endowments. They founded charitable institutions, contributed to public buildings, and were patrons of artisans. They were embedded in the fabric of Ottoman urban civilization beyond their role as soldiers. Their religious life deserves special mention. They were associated with the Bektashi Sufi order, a mystical Islamic brotherhood with notably heterodox theological positions, including a relaxed attitude toward wine and the veneration of Ali. The Bektashi connection was fundamental to Janissary identity. Each order had its own Bektashi chaplain, and rituals were woven into core life. This religious distinctiveness was another element of Janissary group identity. Yet another way the corps maintained its separateness from the rest of Ottoman society. The Janissary bands, known as the Meta, were a crucial part of Janissary culture. Their military music was more than just a battlefield tool. It was a profound cultural institution. Meta bands, with kettle drums, cymbals, trumpets, and zurna horns, played music unlike anything in Europe. Their sound was enormous, aggressive, designed to unsettle enemies and inspire troops. European commanders noted its psychological impact. But the Meta was also an art form. Compositions were sophisticated, multi-layered, following ceremonial forms for battle, victory, or guard changes. This tradition became a significant cultural export. Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven imitated its rhythmic energy in their alla turca music. The bass drum, cymbals, and triangle, now standard in Western orchestras, were absorbed directly from the Janissary band tradition. Imagine an army so feared it caused enemy commanders sleepless nights, never defeated. Then, watch it turn its weapons on its own rulers. Suleiman the Magnificent's death in 1566 marked the beginning of a long, painful decline. He died at 71 during the siege of Sigetvar. His Grand Vizier kept his death secret for 3 weeks to prevent the army from losing heart. A poignant end for the greatest Ottoman ruler. What followed were sultans less capable, less decisive, unable to manage the political and military forces Suleiman had balanced. The Janissaries, with their strong corporate identity, began to fill this power vacuum, asserting their growing influence. The first problem was the corruption of the Devshirme system. It was resented by Muslim Turks, who were explicitly excluded. The logic was grim. Turkish Muslims had loyalties, making them less reliable. Devshirme boys, having nothing, could be trusted with everything. By the late 16th century, Turkish families bribed their way into the corps. Financial and social benefits were too attractive to ignore. The Devshirme's exclusivity couldn't resist pressure. By the early 17th century, it was dead. Janissaries were recruited from free Muslims. This change had vast consequences. Original recruits, torn from families, were different from Muslim Turks with existing social networks. The new Janissaries had loyalties to communities, shared grievances, and were embedded in society, which the original corps prevented. The prohibition on marriage was abandoned. By 1600, most Janissaries were married, living in their own homes, not barracks. Practicing trades alongside military service became the norm. Many enrolled for pay and privileges, not primarily to be soldiers. Some Janissarys were merchants or laborers who bought enrollment through bribery, never handling a weapon in their lives. The corps exploded in size due to this corruption, from 12,000 to over 100,000. But most were not soldiers. They were civilians drawing military pay. The actual fighting strength, deployable on campaign, remained a fraction of the total. This corruption predictably affected military effectiveness. Campaigns showed inconsistent performance. They could still fight magnificently when well led, but also refused to advance, demanded bonuses, or simply left the battlefield. Ironically, as military effectiveness declined, their political role grew. An army less effective at fighting became more effective at making sultans. They always had a formal role in succession, accepting new sultans for a donative, a cash bonus. Originally, mutual recognition. Over time, it became extortion. By the early 17th century, every new sultan was expected to pay a substantial donative. Sultans who couldn't or wouldn't pay were at risk. Janissarys had a direct way to express displeasure. They overthrew the cauldrons. Overturning the sacred cooking cauldrons, symbols of loyalty, was a formal declaration of revolt. Its visual power was enormous. It meant, "We reject our food from you, we reject your authority, we are in rebellion." A powerful, unmistakable message. The Janissarys overthrew sultans 17 times between 1600 and 1826. 17. Some were precise political interventions. Others were bloody, chaotic events, leaving Topkapi Palace swimming in royal blood. Sultan Osman II was murdered by his own soldiers. Sultan Ibrahim Mafur, mentally unstable, was deposed and strangled in 1648. The Janissarys were the most powerful political force. Their history shows how an elite military corps, once the empire's strength, became its greatest internal threat, shaping its destiny. The military decline of the Janissarys was starkly revealed in the wars of the late 17th century, particularly in the catastrophic failure of the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna in 1683, a consequential military event. The Siege of Vienna was the culmination of an Ottoman grand strategic thrust into Central Europe. Under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, an army of 150,000 men, including Janissarys, reached Vienna. The city's garrison of 11,000 men, under Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, held out with determination. The siege revealed serious problems with the Ottoman military system. Kara Mustafa's approach was methodical but slow, resisting Janissarys' calls for direct assault. The Janissarys showed flashes of their old quality, fighting off sorties by the garrison. But the overall Ottoman effort lacked the driving urgency of earlier campaigns. On September 11-12, 1683, a relief army appeared, led by King Jan III Sobieski of Poland. His coalition force of Poles, Germans, and Austrians made a dramatic downhill charge. This was the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, breaking the Ottoman army's rear and flanks. Kara Mustafa's forces collapsed, caught between the garrison and the relief army. The retreat became a rout. The Grand Vizier was executed on his return to Istanbul for his failure. Vienna in 1683 was a turning point in the military history of Europe and the Ottoman Empire. For the first time in over 2 centuries, the Ottoman advance into Europe had been permanently halted. The Great Turkish War saw Ottomans driven from Hungary, signing the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. This was the first major treaty where Ottomans surrendered conquered territories to Christian European powers. It was a psychological as much as a strategic blow. The military performance of the Janissarys in this period was mixed but generally declining. They fought well in some engagements, like the campaigns against the Venetians in Crete. But wars against the Habsburg and Russian empires revealed a serious gap in military technology. European armies had been undergoing continuous reform throughout the 17th century. The military revolution produced armies superior to the Janissarys in discipline, firepower, and tactics. The Janissarys had adopted the flintlock musket, and their artillery was still formidable. Their courage in battle was never seriously in question, But the corporate culture of the corps had become an obstacle to military reform. Any attempt to change Janissary equipment, organization, or tactics was resisted. The corps that had once adapted to firearms now refused to adapt further. The wars against Russia in the 18th century made the problem undeniable. Peter the Great's military modernization produced a Russian army that repeatedly defeated Ottoman forces. The Russo-Turkish Wars saw the Ottomans lose territory steadily: Azov, Crimea, the Danube provinces. By the 18th century, every serious Ottoman military thinker recognized the Janissaries were a hindrance. The question was not whether reform was necessary, but whether reform was possible. Several sultans tried. Mahmud I and Mustafa III made tentative efforts. They brought in French advisors and established new military engineering schools. But these reforms worked around the Janissaries rather than confronting them directly. Selim III was more ambitious. He recognized that half measures would not be enough. In 1794, he created the Nizam-e-Chedid, the new order, a new army corps. The Nizam-e-Chedid was recruited, paid, trained, and housed separately from the Janissaries. The new corps showed real promise in campaigns of the late 1790s and early 1800s. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 demonstrated the gap between modern European and Ottoman forces. But the Janissaries saw the Nizam-e-Chedid as a direct threat to their power and privileges. In 1807, a Janissary revolt, the Kabakçı Mustafa Rebellion, overthrew Selim III. The Nizam-e-Chedid was abolished. Selim was deposed and later murdered. The reform program was ended. It demonstrated the fundamental problem. The Janissaries were deeply embedded in Ottoman political life, essential to the balance of the empire. So capable of mobilizing support against reform that no sultan could safely confront them. Yet no sultan could safely leave them unreformed. It was a trap that seemed to have no exit. The man who found the exit was Sultan Mahmud II, and his solution was as radical as it was bloody. Mahmud II came to power in 1808, in the chaos following Selim III's murder. He had watched his reforming cousin murdered by the very force that was supposed to protect him. He spent the first decade of his reign consolidating his power, watching and waiting. He knew that a direct confrontation without adequate preparation would end in disaster. He spent years quietly building the political and military coalitions that he would need. He cultivated the religious establishment, the ulama, whose support would be essential. He quietly developed relationships with units in the regular army, the Sipahi cavalry and artillery. He gathered intelligence on Janissary dispositions, loyalties, and potential leaders. And he created, quietly and carefully, a new military unit. In 1826, he announced the formation of the Eşkinci, a new infantry unit organized and trained on European lines, specifically designed to supplement and eventually replace the Janissaries. He framed this carefully. The new unit was not a replacement for the Janissaries. It was an addition. The Janissaries could participate in its training if they wished. But they were not fooled. They recognized the Eşkinci for what it was, Selim III's Nizam-e-Chedid, under a different name. And in June 1826, they did what they had done so many times before. They overturned their cauldrons. They marched on the Hippodrome. They demanded the dissolution of the new unit and the dismissal of reformist advisors. This time, Mahmud was ready. The imperial standard, the sacred banner of the Prophet, was brought out, calling all faithful Muslims to the Sultan's side. The religious establishment issued a fetwa, a religious ruling, condemning the revolt. The artillery units, quietly relocated to positions overlooking the Janissary barracks, opened fire. The Janissary barracks, the Ağ Kapısı, were bombarded. Those who tried to flee were cut down. Those who attempted to surrender were, in many cases, killed anyway. The fire from the cannon set the wooden barracks ablaze, and the men trapped inside burned. In Istanbul and across the empire, Janissary leaders were arrested, tried, and executed or exiled. The corps' assets, its properties, its endowments, its cauldrons, were confiscated and destroyed. Its sacred standards were confiscated and destroyed. The Bektashi order, so closely associated with the Janissaries, was banned. Mahmud II called this event the Vaka-u Hayriye, the auspicious incident. The institution that had served the Ottoman Empire for more than 4 centuries, that had stood at the center of the most powerful military force in the world, that had conquered Constantinople and reached the gates of Vienna, was erased in a single day. The death toll in Istanbul alone was somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 Janissaries killed. Across the empire, the purge continued for months as Janissary officers and leaders were systematically tracked down and eliminated. It was brutal, it was swift, and it was, from Mahmud's perspective, absolutely necessary. The Janissaries had become a cancer eating at the heart of the empire, and no partial treatment had ever succeeded. Only total excision could save the patient. You cannot understand modern Turkey, the modern Balkans, or military institutions anywhere without understanding the Janissaries, because the patterns they established, the problems they created, and the solutions they forced their enemies to find, shaped the world we live in today. Let us count the ways. The short-term political effects of the Janissaries' destruction were almost immediately positive for Mahmud II. He replaced the corps with the Asakiri Mansure-i Muhammadiye, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad, a new army organized on European lines. He was able to push through a range of other reforms in education, administration, and eventually even dress. He would later impose the fez, banning traditional headgear that had been impossible while the Janissaries were there to veto any change. But the long-term consequences of 5 centuries of Janissary power on Ottoman political culture were profound and not easily undone. The Janissaries had created a political environment in which military force was routinely deployed in political disputes, in which the loyalty of the armed forces could never be taken for granted, and in which any significant reform required prior political neutralization of vested military interests. This pattern, the military as political actor, the army as kingmaker, the constant threat of coup as a check on sultanly power, did not simply disappear. It had become embedded in the political culture of the empire. The 19th and 20th centuries of Ottoman and then Turkish history would see repeated iterations of this pattern. The Young Turks, who overthrew Sultan Abdülhamid II in 1908, were military officers. The coup that established the Turkish Republic in the 1920s was a military movement, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, a general. The Turkish military intervened in politics multiple times in the 20th century, explicitly positioning itself as the guardian of the Kemalist state against political forces it considered dangerous. The deep and reflexive connection between military power and political legitimacy in Turkish political culture is a long echo of the Janissary centuries. The global military legacy of the Janissaries is equally important, and in many ways more immediately traceable. The Janissaries were among the first military institutions in world history to combine the key elements of what we now consider a professional army: regular salaries, standardized training, a formal rank structure, institutional identity that transcended individual service, and a peacetime existence. Dedicated to maintaining military readiness. These characteristics seem obvious to us now because every modern army has them. In the 14th and 15th centuries, they were revolutionary. European rulers who encountered the Janissaries were forced to confront the gap between their own feudal military systems and the Ottoman professional army. The responses they developed would eventually produce the European military revolution. Of the 16th and 17th centuries, standing armies, professional infantry, standardized drill and weapons, state-funded military logistics. All of these developments were in part responses to the challenge posed by Ottoman military organization. This is not to say that European military development was simply a reaction to the Janissaries. It had its own internal logic and its own dynamics. But the Ottoman threat was a constant presence in the background of European military thinking, a concrete demonstration of what professional infantry could achieve, that European commanders could not ignore. The specific combination of firearms and discipline that the Janissaries exemplified was adopted, adapted, and eventually surpassed by European armies, but the demonstration that such a combination was possible and that it was devastatingly effective came from the Janissaries. The Battle of Nicopolis, 1396, the Battle of Mohacs, 1526, the Siege of Rhodes, 1522, and dozens of other Ottoman victories forced European military establishments to reconsider their doctrines. The development of the bastion fort, the angular, low-profile fortification designed to resist cannon fire, was directly driven by the need to withstand Ottoman siege artillery. The shift from city walls in the medieval style to the Tres Italienne defensive system that spread across Europe in the 16th century was a direct military technological response to the Ottoman threat. In the Middle East and North Africa, the legacy of the Janissarys was equally complex. The Ottoman system of governance, in which Janissary garrisons were stationed in major provincial cities, providing both military security and a degree of political oversight, created patterns of urban military presence that persisted long after the Janissarys themselves were gone. In Egypt, the legacy of Janissary garrison politics contributed to the complex factional environment, from which Muhammad Ali emerged in the early 19th century to create his own modernized military and eventually his own quasi-independent dynasty. In the Balkans, the memory of the Janissarys shaped nationalist mythology in powerful and lasting ways. For Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, and other Balkan national movements, the Janissarys were both oppressors, the instrument of Ottoman power that had crushed their medieval kingdoms, and paradoxically, evidence of their people's qualities, since many of the most famous Janissarys were of Balkan origin. The Devshirme was experienced by Balkan Christian families as a profound humiliation and a source of grief, and this grief fed into the nationalist narratives of the 19th century that would eventually tear the Ottoman Balkans apart. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389, which the Janissaries had won decisively, became the central myth of Serbian national identity, not as a victory, but as a defeat, a martyrdom, a sacred loss that defined the Serbian people's sense of themselves for centuries. The fact that the Janissaries who won it were themselves partly of Balkan Christian origin was one of the deeper ironies of Balkan history. The impact of the Janissaries on military music deserves its own place in the legacy section. The alla turca tradition in Western classical music, which gave us the Turkish March in Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, the finale of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and dozens of other works, was a direct cultural transmission from the Janissary band tradition. The instruments themselves, the bass drum, cymbals, triangle, and piccolo that became standard in European military bands, were all adopted from the Ottoman mater. Every military band in the world today plays in a tradition that traces directly to the Janissaries. Any complete history of the Janissaries must reckon with the Devshirme, the child levy, in moral as well as historical terms. The Devshirme was, by any contemporary ethical standard, a severe violation of human rights. Children were taken from their families, often against their will, certainly without their meaningful consent, converted to a different religion, stripped of their identities, and put to lives of state service. Families who lost children to the Devshirme grieved. There are records of parents bribing officials to spare their sons, of mothers hiding boys in forests, of fathers maiming their sons to make them ineligible for selection. The human cost of the system was real and significant. At the same time, the Devshirme created a pathway to power and status that was available to almost no one else in the social structure of the medieval world. The boy taken from a Christian village in Bulgaria could rise to become Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire. Several of Suleiman the Magnificent's Grand Viziers, including the brilliant Ibrahim Pasha and the long-serving Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, were Devshirme men who rose to positions of extraordinary power. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha governed the empire effectively for nearly 15 years across the reigns of 3 sultans. Whether the opportunity for advancement compensated for the manner in which it was obtained is not a question that has a clean answer. It is a question that reveals the enormous complexity of historical moral judgment, the way in which systems that were, by broad measures, exploitative and brutal, could simultaneously produce individuals who found in those systems meaning, purpose, identity, and even something they experienced as freedom. The Janissaries themselves, in the period of their greatness, displayed a fierce pride in their core and their identity that is hard to reconcile with a simple narrative of victimhood. They were proud of what they were. they fought to maintain their traditions. They resisted, with great effectiveness, any attempt to change the nature of their institution. They had, in the deepest sense, made the Ottoman military world their own, had transformed what began as a system of coercive extraction into a genuine institutional culture, with its own values, its own rituals, its own sense of honor. The Devshirme boys who became Janissarys had, in most cases, no memory of any other life by the time they were adults. The religion they had been converted to was their religion. The language they had been taught was their language. The comrades they had trained with were their family. To call this false consciousness would be to deny them the full complexity of their humanity. And yet the coercion at the origin of the system was real, and the grief of the families from whom the boys were taken was real. This is one of the places where history refuses to be simple, where the honest response is not a verdict but an acknowledgement of complexity. The story of the Janissarys ended, formally, institutionally, in 1826, but their echoes reverberate to this day in ways both obvious and subtle. The concept of the professional standing army, the force that the Janissarys pioneered, is now so universal that it is hard to imagine a world without it. Every nation-state maintains a professional military. Every military has a rank structure, a pay system, regular training, institutional identity. The basic architecture of the modern military institution was, in significant part, invented or at least powerfully demonstrated by the Janissarys. The specific challenge that the Janissarys posed, the standing army as a political force capable of determining who rules, is a challenge that every state in the world has had to navigate. The question of civilian control of the military, of how to maintain a professional armed force without that force becoming a political faction, is directly descended from the problems that Murad I created when he founded the Devshirme. Every modern state that has struggled with military coups, praetorian politics, or the political intervention of armed forces is navigating a problem that the Janissarys made visible and dramatic on an enormous scale. Turkey, the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, abolished the formal political role of the military with the 2016 coup attempt and the subsequent purges of the officer corps by President Erdogan. Whatever one thinks of the political dynamics of that process, it represents a final chapter in a story that began when Murad I first dressed his household troops in white felt caps and gave them cauldrons as their symbols. The story of how a state manages the power of the force that protects it. The Balkans continue to live with the long consequences of the Ottoman centuries in which the Janissarys played so central a role. The borders of the modern Balkan states, the religious demographics of Bosnia and Kosovo, the complex ethnic politics of North Macedonia and Bulgaria, all of these reflect the layered history of Ottoman rule, Janissary garrison politics, and the nationalist movements that eventually overthrew that order. The military music tradition lives on in every marching band and every military parade. The bass drum that keeps the beat at the Rose Bowl parade, the cymbals that crash in the football stadium, the piccolo that shrieks over the brass. All of them are, in a direct and traceable line, the legacy of the Janissary meta bands that marched across 4 continents under the banner of the Ottoman sultans, and the story of the Devshirme, of the state that takes children, strips them of their identity, and uses them as instruments of power, continues to resonate in discussions of child soldiers, forced conscription, and the ethics of state power over individuals. The Janissarys are not simply a historical curiosity. They are a mirror in which the modern world can see its own questions reflected back across 5 centuries. Let us now stand back and look at the full arc of the Janissary story, from beginning to end. They were founded by Murad I around 1363-1365 as a solution to the problem of military loyalty in a fast-growing empire. They were built on the Devshirme, the systematic conversion of Christian boys into Muslim soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. They were organized around the imagery of the household, the cauldron, the soup man commander, the communal meal. And they developed a ferocious institutional identity and corporate pride. They first tasted battle in the campaigns of the 1380s and proved themselves decisively at Kosovo in 1389, where the combination of disciplined infantry, fortified positions, and coordinated cavalry that would define Ottoman tactical thinking for generations first appeared in mature form. They grew in power and prestige through the campaigns of Bayezid I, survived the catastrophe of Ankara and the Ottoman interregnum, and returned under Mehmed I and Murad II as a reinvigorated force. They reached their first great peak under Mehmed II, whose conquest of Constantinople in 1453, with the Janissaries as the decisive shock force, remains one of the most dramatic military events in history. They expanded and refined their firearms tactics through the 15th and early 16th centuries, demonstrating at Calderon and in Egypt that a disciplined infantry force armed with gunpowder weapons could neutralize even the finest cavalry. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, they participated in conquests that made the Ottoman Empire the most powerful state in the world. Then the long decline began. The corruption of the Devshirme system, the opening of the rolls to Turkish Muslims, the abandonment of celibacy and barracks life, the explosive growth of paper rolls at the expense of military effectiveness. All of these eroded the core from within. The political power of the Janissaries grew as their military effectiveness declined, creating the deadly paradox that consumed the empire's reform efforts for 2 centuries. They blocked every serious attempt at military modernization, the Nizam al-Sedid of Selim III being the most tragic example, until the moment they overturned their cauldrons for the last time in 1826, and met, instead of a sultan who backed down, a sultan who had prepared for exactly this moment. Mahmud II's artillery ended the Janissary Corps in a day. The legacy they left was enormous and contradictory. They were the greatest military force of their age, and they became the greatest obstacle to military modernization. They were the personal instruments of the Sultan, and they became the Sultan's most dangerous adversaries. They were taken from Christian families and converted to Islam, and they became one of the most distinctively Islamic military institutions in history. They were bound to the household of the Sultan, and they became an independent political force, capable of making and unmaking sultans at will. 500 years after their founding, the Janissaries remain one of the most fascinating, complex, and consequential military institutions in the history of the world. They shaped the borders of Europe, the course of the Crusades' long aftermath, the development of military music, the political culture of Turkey and the Balkans, the theory and practice of the professional standing army, and the global history of firearms in warfare. They were extraordinary soldiers, complex human beings, and a system that embodied both the genius and the horror of the Ottoman imperial project. The white felt cap, the great cauldron, the thundering drums of the Meta, the disciplined ranks advancing in perfect unison while their enemies shook with fear. For nearly 500 years, from the plains of Kosovo to the walls of Vienna, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Persia, the Janissaries wrote their story in fire and blood and conquest. And when that story ended, when the cannons of Mahmud II reduced their barracks to rubble and their cauldrons lay overturned for the last time, the world they had helped to make remained, shaped indelibly by everything they had been. They were the new soldiers, and the world has never quite been the same since. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into the history of the Janissaries. If you made it all the way to the end, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Someone who wants to understand not just the what of history, but the why and the how, and what it all means for the world we live in today. The Janissaries are one of those subjects where the more you learn, the more you realize how much more there is to know. Every battle we touched on, every campaign we discussed, every political crisis we traced, each of them deserves its own full exploration. The fall of Constantinople alone could fill many hours of deep history content. The life of Suleiman the Magnificent could fill a season. If there are specific aspects of the Janissary story that you would like to explore further, please leave those requests in the comments. Your engagement drives this content, and your curiosity is what makes these deep dives worth doing. If you found this video valuable, please share it with someone you think would enjoy it. History like this, complex, human, full of consequence, deserves a wide audience. The people who lived these stories deserve to be remembered and understood. Thank you truly for your time and your curiosity. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and never stop looking at the past with wide open eyes. Cheers.